in the chat, let us know what questions you have, where you're from, your connection to housing or child welfare. And just one more minute. Hello, Karen from Mecklenburg. Hello from Hawaii. So I'm Jenny Gentry with Casey Family Programs. So welcome to the Art of the Possible. You'll learn how to advance child and family well-being through housing, specifically using funds from the American Rescue Plan. These partners each realized that they had a different piece of the puzzle to advance child and family well-being through housing. And I think we're going to put links to each organization's homepage in the chat. As our presenters come on and share, they will introduce themselves. Here's our agenda today. It looks very high level, but you will get lots of information. Our hope is at the end of the webinar, you will have tools to take action. And with that, I turn it to Dr. David Sanders for welcome remarks. Dr. Sanders is Casey's Executive Vice President of Systems Improvement, overseeing the Foundation's work with child welfare systems to improve practice, with an emphasis on ensuring safe and permanent families for children. He also oversees the Foundation's public policy and research work. Dr. Sanders was appointed by President Obama to chair the Federal Commission to eliminate child abuse and neglect fatalities. David?
Thank you, Jenny. Good morning to everybody. I have been asked to do a brief welcome, and I will hopefully successfully accomplish that task. So welcome to everybody. But I want to first start by thanking the Corporation for Supportive Housing, Chapin Hall, and Public Consulting Group for partnering on this webinar. And more importantly, I think demonstrating the importance of working between child welfare and housing professionals on this issue of housing. And I'm going to touch on that in closing off my welcome. And we really want to offer opportunities for individuals who've traditionally worked on housing and those who've traditionally worked on child welfare to really work together on this, on the issues related to housing, and in part because of what Jenny mentioned, the impact of housing on child and family well-being. We know that housing is a fundamental need, fundamental responsibility, and one of the issues that's looked at in understanding whether children have been abused or neglected and whether they can return to their families, and oftentimes whether they are removed from their families. And so this is one of the most important issues we believe that can be addressed in the child welfare system, and it requires a comprehensive approach. We think that the American Rescue Plan funding is an opportunity for supporting well-being and stability, and so want to continue discussing access to those funds. But what I wanted to, so again, that's my welcome, and I will want to make sure that again, I've accomplished that task. But I did want to share an experience that I've had as a child welfare director, and really, I think, speaking to the importance of housing. And in so many experiences as a child welfare director, you kind of get either jaded over time or they become so common. But one that probably the single most impactful experience that I had was over a series of months when I was director in Los Angeles County. And I don't know how many of you have ever been on Skid Row in Los Angeles, but it is one of the most, one of the largest focused areas for homelessness in the United States. And in downtown Los Angeles, there are a number of blocks where homeless are end up staying in tents in communities on the streets in Los Angeles. And this was a number of years ago when I was director. One of the elected officials said to me, so there are infants who are on Skid Row. Why does the Child Protection Agency allow that? And I thought it was a good question. My response was that, well, California law prohibits the involvement of child protection because of homelessness. And so, I thought I had given such a great answer, but the reality was that we had infants on the streets in Los Angeles, and the agency that was designed to protect children was not involved. And as much as I might have been able to state all of the reasons for that, it was an issue. And so I was asked, maybe directed, to spend several months just about 2 to 3 times a week on Skid Row, walking around, seeing what was happening. And quite frankly, it was absolutely devastating. It is devastating to see thousands of individuals, homeless individuals, in the streets with very little support. And some of them were children. And so the question was, so what were we going to do about it? And it was the probably the most important moment for me as a child welfare director in understanding this is not a child protection issue, but it's also not an issue that child protection can ignore. It is not only a housing issue, because there are children, and how do we assure the well-being of children? This was not an issue that either of us could address alone. And we really needed to think of a different way of working together to actually assure that families had their needs met. And so we did put together a team. That team is, as I understand, is still in place, which is 15 years later, but really does intervene as a team to assure that children have housing, that their families have adequate housing, and that they aren't on the street. And so it's something that was concentrated in Los Angeles, but can occur every place does occur every place in the country. And so this is an opportunity for us to look at how do we make sure that the well-being needs of children and families are met, and that we are really addressing the issues that families face in a way that's realistic and a way that's effective. So thank you for your interest in this, and welcome to everybody. And I'll turn it back to you, Jenny.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate that experience that you shared. It really makes the point as to why this is so important. And now we're going to go to Claire Anderson with Chapin Hall.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jenny. As soon as the slides come back up. And thank you, Dr. Sanders, for that opening. It is quite important for us to think about child well-being in the context of housing, and in the context of policy choices that we make in a variety of parts of our human service sector. We're beginning to understand through research from researchers across the country the predictors of involvement with child welfare. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we see the strongest predictors of investigated neglect reports. And we see a few of these relate to housing, short duration of residence, difficulty paying rent, utility shut off as key predictors. And on the left-hand side, we also see housing hardship as among the most reliable economic predictors of child welfare system involvement, alongside income loss or shocks in income and economics of a household, and cumulative material hardship. So we're getting much better at being able to understand what's happening in the lives of families that creates the context in which child welfare is involved. Next slide. We are also seeing a number of studies that are helping us to understand the policy context and the macroeconomic context that creates increased risk for child welfare system involvement. The studies that you see here have various levels of evidence, but are beginning to help us really sort of home in on what we believe to be driving involvement with child welfare. And we see lack of stable housing among the increased risk factors for child welfare system involvement. Next slide. So I'm going to talk then a little bit more deeply about that one housing instability square. We have collected and synthesized information about all of the others, and I'll drop in the chat a link as soon as I'm finished talking that will help you sort of understand the broader context. But when we look at housing specifically, we know that inadequate housing contributes to the risk of entering foster care for about 1 of every 6 children involved in CPS investigations. Next slide. We also see increased risks around evictions and foreclosures. I think this is very interesting data insofar as it helps us understand that it is not solely the chronic homeless, as Dr. Sanders was describing, but this shock in the household, an income shock, a housing shock also seems to create increased risk. We see that households experiencing a foreclosure filing in the next 6 to 12 months are at 70% greater risk of a CPS investigation than households that do not have the foreclosure. We also see increases in mortgage delinquency and foreclosure rates being associated with increased hospital admissions for physical abuse of children under the age of 6 and traumatic brain injury for infants under the age of 1. I think we often believe that it is neglect that we are addressing when we are trying to stabilize housing. But the evidence is increasingly clear that we are also talking about the abuse of children occurring at being associated with these economic or housing shocks in the household. Next slide. So we know that supportive housing provides a comprehensive array of supports, not just the affordable housing itself. Supportive housing really does include employment services, parenting and life skills, primary health services, mental health, substance abuse treatment as needed, case management services. So really it's a comprehensive, holistic approach to supporting family stability and family and child well-being. Next slide. These are 2 important randomized control trials. They are different studies looking at supportive housing. From my colleague, Dr. Ann Farrell, she looked at the Connecticut Supportive Housing Program that was a housing voucher and case management, and saw fewer removals, 9% versus 40% in the business as usual control group, a lower prevalence of substantiated maltreatment, 8% versus 26% in the control group after 18 months, and increased reunification, 30% versus 9% in the control group after 2 years. And the HUD Family Option Study found that for the homeless families that were referred for permanent housing subsidies, there was another group that received supportive housing, but this was the group that got the permanent subsidy, and they self-reported 50% fewer foster care placements in the 20-month follow-up. I hope that this evidence helps us to understand context and where we have seen studies and research help point us in a particular direction.
Thank you, Claire. The data is really important, but so are the stories behind it. So Lisa is going to help me out and show a video about a mother and her son, the intersection of child welfare and housing and family well-being.
One of my big fears, like when I was little, was my mom like leaving. I guess everything kind of hit me when I was in my second foster home. I was like, okay, this is weird. I haven't seen my mom in like 2 months already. I was 6. Yeah.
Well, the main thing right now for a lot of these families are housing issues. And once housing is not stable, you know, you can't really concentrate on any other thing because you just want to find that apartment. That's Brony. 1 second.
You gotta have somewhere to go, but there's nowhere to go if you don't have no money to pay your rent. Rough neighborhood growing up. I was sexually molested by my grandfather. You name it, my family was on it. And that's what I learned. I would leave Brandon home alone. I would go take care of what I had to take care of, come back home, get high. And the cops come and they charge me for neglect.
The first foster home was kind of a little disorganized. There was a whole bunch of other foster kids, and I didn't go to school.
A lot of the teenagers tend to drop out because they're going from one shelter to the other, so they have to change schools.
Started off in Astoria, and then I went to Long Island City, and then I came here. It was pretty hard to find friends.
Without these type of housings being built, a lot of people be in the streets, and the cycle on and on and on. It's an ongoing cycle. I knew I was going away and my son was gonna be taken from me. When I heard that, I'm like, no, something has to change. I did my programs, my parenting, my substance abuse, whatever it took, I did. And I got him back. The new beginning for me and my son to start all over and build on our relationship.
It felt kind of weird, I guess, because I haven't seen her in so long, but looking back now, like, my mom went through a lot to try and get me back.
You have to ask for help in order to get help.
There's always someone willing to go over to help you.
Anytime I have a problem, like I can go to her and no matter what it is, at the end of the day, if it's good or bad, like I always come out of there with my heart filled.
I had clients that come in here just to cry in the mornings. And I let them cry and I let them let it out. And, you know, I can't tell them what to do, but I can just advise them on how to get the assistance that you need. And then you can also leave feeling better that you've accomplished something.
He's graduating high school next month, and I'm so proud. He got into LIU, university, he's happy. I just feel that there's so much more that's coming. I'm gonna get this GED, and I'm going to higher education, and I'm gonna move forward. At the end of the day, my son, he's changed my life. And like, I'm thankful to my son because if it wasn't for him, I don't know where I'd be.
All right. We are now going to hear about programs available through the American Rescue Plan to support housing. We'll start with Vanessa McGaw, Outreach Director for ERA at the U.S. Department of Treasury.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to talk today about ERA. And up top, I want to thank everyone for the hard work that you are doing to support families across the country as they navigate many challenges, including housing instability. So next slide. Emergency rental assistance funds became available to states, localities, tribes, and territories in the beginning of 2021. So approximately a year and a half ago. They're intended to address emergency housing needs of renters or issues related to the COVID-19 crisis in an environment where countless renters were already facing significant housing stability challenges. So through these two programs, Congress allocated about $64 billion for emergency rental assistance, $25 billion through ERA-1, which included allocations for tribes, tribally designated housing entities in the Department of Hawaii and Homelands. These funds generally expire September 30th, 2022, with a 90-day extension for those who receive reallocated funds. So this is expiring very soon, and many programs are moving from ERA-1 into ERA-2 spending. There is 21.55 billion for ERA-2. There are slightly different rules and requirements. So it's somewhat more flexible to use ERA-2 dollars still for rental assistance. And these funds generally expire September 30th, 2025. And to really push these funds out, recognize the emergency situation, Treasury has leaned in on strategies to make sure that families in need are receiving these funds as soon as possible. So this has included encouraging flexibilities in the documentation for program eligibility, including innovations in making that happen. We've also strongly encouraged grantees to work with trusted partners, including those providing culturally and linguistically relevant services, in order to reach households most vulnerable to housing instability. Next slide. So how has this gone? Well, there has been a massive amount of infrastructure development this past year. Early in the program, there was a lot of ramp up necessary as programs engaged contracts, developed partnerships, either created new infrastructure or really had to scale up what were much smaller programs. In the fall, we saw big increases in payments to households. The Eviction Lab estimated by the end of 2021 that 1 million evictions were avoided, especially for very low-income families and in communities of color. And households are continuing to be reached by ERA programs. Some programs still have a significant amount of funds. Some have needed to close applications. Of those, some have continued to provide limited ERA assistance for those most at risk of housing instability, such as those who are in eviction processes. Treasury is engaged in reallocation of funds to ensure that as many people avoid losing their housing as possible, recognizing the emergency nature of the program. And we're also encouraging braiding of funds and exploring other funds to continue to build off of the infrastructure developed by these efforts. Next slide. So within that, the existing funds remaining and the potential of additional funds, there's still a lot of opportunity to build off of the lessons learned through ERA development. And so we're encouraging grantees to consider how they will continue to help renters into the future in their communities. So that while many households experienced a short-term shock for which ERA was really a critical lifeline to get them back on track, there are also many households who need more support because they were already in a cycle of financial and housing distress. So at Treasury, we're working to identify and lift up programs that are integrating ERA programs with other services, maybe in the form of referral services, investing in housing workers, writing program resources, etc. We have a page on our promising practices. We have a promising practices section of our website, which includes a lot of grantees examples. One dedicated to housing stability services that describes in more detail some of these efforts. I'm personally really excited about some of the programs where they're really developing communities of learning, taking lessons learned from the ERA and bringing it to a network of local providers to increase housing stability learnings from this program into the future. Next slide. There are a lot of creative efforts supported by some of the ERA flexibilities in the use of funding. So while they can support rent and utilities, funding can also support eviction prevention, counseling, housing support. In some cases, within certain criteria, can support those currently experiencing housing get into a rental obligation. And there's just a lot of, there have been a lot of interesting programs out there, and to the extent that these program developments can be learned from, expanded through the rating of other funds, that's really exciting. So next slide. We of course recognize that Treasury, we recognize that ERA funds are not a long-term funding source. So we're strongly encouraging states and localities to consider the use of other funds to support continued infrastructure development, to support renters, and not allowing the lessons learned from this crisis to completely to fall away, not allow this infrastructure to fall away. So with that, I'm going to pass the presentation on to my colleague Namratha to talk about state and local fiscal recovery funds.
Great, thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you to the KC Family Programs for inviting me to be here today. I'm really glad to be here to talk to you about the state and local fiscal recovery funds and how these funds can be used to support child welfare services and housing security. The American Rescue Plan included $350 billion in fiscal support for state, local, and tribal governments and territories, which is a historic investment in these governments and in local communities. Treasury has about 31,000 direct recipients of this program, which should help you understand the scale of how many governments have received funds from Treasury. Since the program launched in May 2021, Treasury has paid out more than $332 billion to governments, representing about 95% of funds available, which means that many of the governments that you're working with at the state and local level have already received their funds, and if they have not received their second tranche funds, should receive them soon. So most recipients receive funds in 2 evenly split tranches, and recipients started receiving second tranche funds 2 months ago in May this year. And many are still working to budget their entire allocation, which hopefully gives you an opportunity as advocates to work with your governments on how they spend these funds. By the end of 2021, over 150 governments budgeted over $3.3 billion to help people experiencing homelessness find safe, stable housing, including through permanent supportive housing. We hope that those in this audience will work with their respective state and local governments to help facilitate further work in these areas, as Treasury sees affordable housing services and development as a key priority of the state and local fiscal recovery funds. I wanted to give you an overview of the final rule for this program, which was released in January, to help you understand just how broad this program is, as important background if you want to engage your governments in spending their funds towards affordable housing development, housing services, and other assistance to households, families, and children. The State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program, sometimes called SLFRF for short, provides substantial flexibility for each jurisdiction to meet local needs within 4 separate eligible use categories, as bucketed in this slide of this presentation. Recipients may use SLFRF funds to replace lost public sector revenue, using this funding to provide government services up to the amount of revenue lost during the pandemic. That is the most flexible eligible use. Each government is able to claim some amount of funds in government loss, in revenue loss. Recipients can use funds to support COVID-19 public health and economic response by addressing COVID-19 and its impact on public health, as well as addressing economic harms to households, small businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries, and the public sector. We'll dive into that a bit more. They can provide premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work, offering additional support to those who have and will bear the greatest health risk because of their service in critical sectors. And they can invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, making necessary investments to improve access to clean drinking water, to support vital wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and to expand affordable access to broadband internet. Under this program, recipients can use funds for costs incurred on or after May 3rd, 2021, which is when the bill passed. And further funds must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, which is in over 2 years, and expended by December 31st, 2026. This time period during which the recipients can expend funds for SLFRF is the period of performance. Next slide, please. I wanted to focus this presentation on explaining the public health and economic impacts eligible use category as it most pertains to the objectives to this audience. Recipients may use funds to support public health and economic response to the pandemic, which includes eligible uses for public health and assistance to respond to the pandemic's negative economic impacts for households, small businesses and nonprofits, aid to impacted industries, and support for the public sector. In general, recipients should first identify a public health or economic impact of the pandemic on an individual or class of individuals, and two, design a response that addresses that impact. Responses must be related and reasonably proportional to the harm experienced. To provide simple and clear uses of funds, the rule has provided a non-exhaustive list of dozens and dozens of eligible uses that are presumed to be reasonably proportional responses to the pandemic's impacts, from vaccine incentives to food and utility assistance, the populations that are presumed eligible, as well as the populations that are presumed eligible to receive them. A summary of the eligible uses that recipients can undertake can be found in the overview of the final rule, which is on Treasury's State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds website. I encourage you to take a look at that document. It does a very good job listing the enumerated uses. For further information on any eligible uses that you might want to provide that are not listed, you can also look to the framework for how to design a program that's responsive to the pandemic. That's also in that overview document. So that's a very good resource as you move forward thinking about these funds. Treasury expanded both the list of non-exhaustive eligible uses and presumptively eligible populations in the final rule. This includes clarifying the availability of services like affordable housing, childcare, food assistance, and support for transportation to and from a job site or interview. These eligible uses can be found on page 18 of the overview of the final rule. The final rule also maintains and expanded on the non-exhaustive list of eligible uses of funds in disproportionately impacted communities like housing vouchers and assistance relocating to neighborhoods with higher economic opportunity. Treasury has expanded and clarified the populations presumed eligible for services, which makes them automatically eligible for services without additional analysis needed on the part of recipients. We really did this to make it as easy as possible for governments to spend their funds on helping those most impacted by the pandemic. So in this clarification of populations presumed for eligible services, this includes defining low and moderate income populations, which are presumed to be impacted by the negative economic impacts of the pandemic, as well as presuming low income populations to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Next slide, please. Third, Treasury has clarified in the public health and economic impacts eligible use categories that recipients may pursue capital expenditures that are a related and reasonably proportional response to a pandemic impact. The rule includes dozens of examples of eligible capital expenditures, including development of affordable housing and permanent supportive housing. Finally, Treasury has broadened eligible uses to support public sector capacity, which is important for the economic recovery and for the maintenance of vital public services. Recipients may now hire government workers up to 7.5% above their pre-pandemic baseline to make up for chronic underinvestment in the public sector since the Great Recession, and use funds in other ways to support workers, such as through retention incentives. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you. I really recommend taking a look at the overview of the final rule itself, and please email us at slfrf@treasury.gov if you have any questions. Affordable housing and services is such an important part of how recipients can use these funds, and we really hope that you'll work with your governments to do so. Now I'll turn it over to Jillian to speak next.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So my name is Jillian Fox. I work with CSH and supporting communities to advance supportive housing. I'm here to talk about another exciting resource that's available through the American Rescue Plan. It's a new program. It's called HOME ARP. This $5 billion program is administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it's provided through a formula allocation to local and state participating jurisdictions. So basically what that means is that most larger cities and counties received a direct allocation of HOME ARP funding, and smaller localities should be able to access HOME ARP funding through their state government partners. And that's typically the state's Housing and Community Development Agency that would be the recipient of the HOME ARP funds. Jurisdictions they have to obligate these funds by 2025, and they have to spend down the funds by 2030. So there's a longer time limit on this, which is really helpful. The resource is flexible in that it can be used in a variety of ways to meet local needs, including building and preserving housing units, providing supportive services to help people access and stay in housing, as well as training and capacity building for the field and provider networks. However, all the funds have to be used to support programs and efforts that assist people with accessing and retaining housing who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, or experiencing homelessness, at risk of homelessness, and those fleeing domestic sexual violence or human trafficking. What's really unique about the HOME ARP program is that it requires jurisdictions to create an allocation plan that has to be approved by HUD before funds are released for eligible uses. So as part of the requirements for the plan, jurisdictions must consult with stakeholders and provide public comment opportunities to inform the plan and the use of those funds. Many jurisdictions are still working through or haven't even started the process to decide how to use HOME ARP funds. In fact, I was just doing some quick math on HUD's page, and it looks like there are only approved plans for about 35 out of the 651 state and local jurisdictions that are receiving HOME ARP funds. So this is just a really great time to reach out to your local government partners, if you haven't already, your local housing agency partners, and understand, how your agency and how you can be at the table to explore ways that HOME ARP can address the needs of child welfare involved families and youth facing housing insecurity and homelessness. This can include providing data. There's a required gaps analysis that has to be done. So providing data to demonstrate the need, kind of shape that gaps analysis and better understand it at a community level. You could help by ensuring people you serve are incorporated into those stakeholder consultation efforts. So the voice of the folks that you're working with are directly received in that process. And providing input and comments on the plan, either through the stakeholder consultation process that the jurisdiction develops or through the public comment process that's required. So they have, all jurisdictions have to hold a public hearing and accept comments from the public and incorporate those in the final plan that they submit to HUD. And you could also be on the planning team directly. So I'm working with a jurisdiction right now that has the lead for the planning team to put together this allocation plan is the county's housing and community development department. So the agency that is responsible for administering these funds. But on the planning team is the local child welfare agency. So they're right there helping to shape the plan, explore the data we need to use, and being right at the table. And I've heard from this jurisdiction, these partners, that this is new to them. They've never kind of worked in this way before, and they're really hoping that this experience leads to continued efforts where they explore ways to partner between housing and child welfare and just collaborate ongoing to meet the needs of people experiencing an at risk of homelessness. Go to the next slide. So just want to share a chart that we put together that identifies how each of the American Rescue Plan funding sources can support the creation of supportive housing. The state and local fiscal recovery funds, offer the most flexibility. I think we feel that the HOME ARP funds are really, really geared or primed to help support new rental housing production, which I think most jurisdictions across the country need new inventory of housing. We're seeing a real lack of just buildings and units to put folks in. So how can we get production going and getting those buildings and units oriented in a way that works for the families that we work with? These resources across ARPA, really can be used to support both short-term actions, right, to rapidly assist child welfare involved families and youth. But I think even more importantly, can really help kickstart that cross-system collaboration through data sharing or data integration efforts, or identifying ways to kind of braid and blend funding together to support high quality projects and high quality supportive housing projects, or at just coordination of services and information exchange and coordination between those local housing delivery systems, local homelessness systems, and the child welfare systems. I think that's so important because we know that our people that we're serving and people experiencing housing insecurity involved in the child welfare system are often touching multiple systems, and we're sharing them. And so we can share the outcomes and share the solutions as well. So thanks for having me talk about that. And I think I'll pass it back to Jenny.
Well, thanks to Vanessa, Namarta, and Jillian. We're now going to go to Katie with Public Consulting Group to hear how states and counties are using these funds. Jillian, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So I'm sure everyone's thinking these are all great programs. How can we sort of integrate these fundings into some of our jurisdictions? And so one really great resource that is available is the Children's Funding Project. It highlights programs across the country and state and local jurisdictions that are funding child welfare services or supportive housing services with various ARPA funding. So it includes state child care stabilization grants, CCDF funds, the state and local fiscal recovery funds, funds to elementary and secondary education, and then the higher education emergency relief fund. So this is a really great resource. I encourage you all to look at it, and it will give you some ideas of some ways that jurisdictions are spending some of these ARPA funding. So you can go to the next slide. We've highlighted a few projects here that we found of states who are using supportive housing to support families and hopefully remaining out of the child welfare system. Ramsey County, Minnesota has set aside $37 million to establish affordable housing investment funds from 2021 through 2025. And this funding is really to increase the housing infrastructure in Ramsey County. Next slide, please. In Washington, more than $4 million has been set aside for direct grants of up to $2,500 to help defray the costs associated with housing, food, medical bills, child care. So these are those concrete goods and services really that Claire was speaking about at the beginning. They've even amended the funding source to allow for the income eligibility threshold to be raised from 40% to 60% of the median income of that area of the state where the grants are being used. Next slide, please. And then here we have several examples of ways that rental assistance and affordable housing have been implemented, ARPA funds. So Multnomah County, Oregon is using about $1.3 million to create a rental assistance program. And this is really working with the local communities to make the funds available to those most in need in Multnomah County. The city of Louisville has helped more than 9,000 households pay for utility expenses to avoid shutoffs during the pandemic, and then also to support security deposits and rent for individuals to secure rental units. Denver, Colorado has set aside more than $28 million to the Affordable Housing Fund, which is providing affordable housing projects, rental projects, and supporting those most at need in their community. And then Kansas City, Missouri is using approximately $12 million funds to invest in their local housing trust fund, again, for housing stability. Next slide, please. So we have put together a survey to learn more about some innovative programs that are utilizing concrete goods and services to assist families with housing stability and to ultimately help prevent the entry into child welfare system, or just to improve the safety, permanency, and well-being of children in their communities. So if your jurisdiction is doing something innovative with the funds that we've talked about on this call today, we would love to hear from you. I think we're going to put the link in the chat. The link is open until August 1st. And we would love to hear from you. If you are looking for more information about programs, please respond to the survey. We can connect with you and put you in contact with individuals across the country. But we're really looking to hear from individuals about innovative projects and how these funds can be put to use to support the communities. So I think I will be turning it back over to Kara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Mergel with CSH. And I just wanted to take a few minutes to let everybody know really how to activate on today's information. We've shared a lot of information about a lot of different resources with you. And so we wanted to give you a pathway forward for who to be connecting with and who to talk to. So this graphic here is really to give you a breakdown of where the money went from each of these resources. Basically to show you that there are multiple entry points to partnering on these funds and advocating for how these funds should be used. So ERA funding went both to state and local jurisdictions, state and local fiscal recovery funds. I call these the Oprah pots of money. You get some, everybody gets some. Basically went to states, counties, and cities. Some locations are working together to get these funds to jurisdictions in the state that may not have received them, or partnering to maximize and marry the funds together at multiple levels. And then on the HOME ARP side, Jillian already mentioned this. These went to what's called participating jurisdictions. So it does vary state by state, but typically those have gone to community development agencies or housing finance agencies to really put together that plan that Jillian talked about. Next slide. So who to contact if you would like to. The folks who are managing these resources in the jurisdictions that we included in the previous slides really are a group of public housing authorities. You can see directory links have been included in the chat, as well as here on this slide. And also part of our follow-up, we will include the links to these directories as well. Housing finance agencies, the homeless response system and continuum of care. And then of course, your state and local governments have been the primary group making decisions around state and local fiscal recovery funds. So we really wanted to equip you with the appropriate, not just in theory what you can do, but really who to reach out to in terms of partnership and advocacy, to really think about talking to them for families, for getting families both the concrete resources as well as the services that they need to really support them in their well-being journey. And next slide. So I will be your point of contact. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions and follow up. As I did mention, we will be sharing all of the slides as well as a learning guide. So if you're reaching out to say, hey, are we going to get slides? Please know the answer is yes. That will take us a couple weeks to send out, but please watch your emails. And if any other questions about getting in contact with anything that we talked about today or any of the presenters, please don't hesitate to email directly. Thank you.